All right, so I just want to welcome everyone to the final installment for 2024 for our AI-SDM seminar series. Today we welcome Professor Alex London from Carnegie Mellon University, and he holds a number of concurrent positions in addition to being an affiliate faculty member at the Center for Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Pittsburgh. He's also the director for the Center of Ethics and Policy at CMU, professor in the Department of Philosophy, the chief ethicist in the Block Center here at CMU, the Clara L. West Professor of Ethics and Philosophy, and the Ken L. Gates Professor of Ethics and Computational Systems. So quite a distinguished list there. His work focuses on ethical and policy issues surrounding the development and the deployment of emerging technologies, particularly in medicine, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. And he's done just a ton of great work, plenty of accolades, more than I could possibly mention here. But I do want to highlight that he's a co-leader of the Ethics Core for our sister institute. That would be the NSF AI Institute for Collaborative Assistance and Responsive Interaction for Network Groups, AI Caring for short. And there have been some interesting crossovers between that work and the work being done in our own institute. So really looking forward to your talk today. Please join me in welcoming Professor London.
Thank you. All right, well, thanks for coming after classes, like the last thing of the semester, so I really appreciate it.
All the students are missing.
What's that?
I think that's why all the students are missing. It's that last week.
Yeah, not the best time, but you know, that's how things roll out. So I'm going to talk about when AI can no longer help, and the subtitle for this could have been advanced planning for AI systems, or advanced care plans for AI systems. But then that I thought people would be like, oh, this is like when the AI is helping you make your advanced care plan, which is not what this is about, right? So this is about agency transfer agreements, which are just something I made up, but it's a little bit clearer. So I'll explain what that is. So what I want to do is talk about where the talk that I'm going to give you fits into stuff we've done at AI Caring very quickly. Then I'm going to explicate the notion of decisional capacity. That will just be review work. That's not novel work. That's just sort of like, what is decisional capacity? How does it work? But that's then prefatory to what are some of the strategies that an AI system could use in order to prolong the period during which older adults actually have decisional capacity, or prolong the period during which they can live in their home independently and carry out some of the tasks that they would need to carry out in order to do that, which require decisional capacity. And then in the course of that, this notion of, well, when do you have agency transfer? So the idea would be if you no longer have decisional capacity, then the whole idea is somebody else has to make decisions for you. The AI system, if it's extending your capacity to do that, then it's delaying the point at which you would reach this sort of agency transfer point. And so what should we do once you do reach that point? And that's what the last part of the talk will be about. So this talk falls into the sort of assisted ambition of AI, which is part of what drives AI Caring. You know, the idea that we want to try to support aging populations through the early stages of cognitive decline in order to try to prolong their ability to live independently. And recent advances are making this, you know, ambition seem much more realizable. So, you know, older adults often have difficulty navigating keyboards, even touchscreens, complex menus. So the idea that you can have a voice interaction with a computer where you just talk to it and, you know, and it will understand you, you know, like, sorry, no movie by that name is playing, you know. So as we make progress on that, then the idea is like, oh, these things could be more accessible to a wider population. Also that you can have multiple instances of the smart assistant. So it could live on your watch or on your phone and in your home, and it would have the ambient sensors in your home, but it would also be able to travel with you to your doctor's appointment perhaps. And so it could be listening to the doctor's appointment and taking notes while your doctor's AI is listening and taking notes or something like that. So now you have the prospect not just of multimodal longitudinal data, but interactive. Like there could be a point in the wild where your AI would be like, wait, what just happened? Right? Like, you know, did you mean to do that? Or And that would give you, that makes the possible the prospect of much more granular models of people and their values, and especially, so one of the things we're working on right now is sort of like eliciting values, but in this much more dynamic, not just like, how can I elicit your values in the lab, but like, how can I use in the wild interactive interactions to facilitate elicitation? So what are some of the tasks that AI could do, in this, that might be the targets? So like managing your finances, helping you manage your finances, helping you pay your bills, organizing all of the health-related appointments, taking your medications, avoiding the things that you're supposed to avoid, in terms of your diet or, your exercise regimen, other stuff like that, monitoring your health status. And then the scheduling that comes up in terms of like making your various appointments and other things like that. So those are all things that, are sort of real targets for AI systems to assist older adults with. So one of the first papers that we did was about how all of this is going to be shot through with ethical implications, because as you start to offload cognitive tasks onto an AI, then you become vulnerable to failures that would arise because the AI lacks a kind of moral discernment, where the idea is there's some ethically relevant feature to a situation, and if the AI can't perceive that and then act correctly, and you've offloaded cognition onto the AI, now you're vulnerable to the failure that arises when the AI doesn't perceive the relevant salient feature of the situation. And so in this paper, we talk about like planning, for instance, scheduling. Scheduling isn't just like, putting the birthday on the calendar, great, you're good to go. Like birthdays and weddings are things that have very deep structure to them. Like you have to bring a gift, you might have to show up with a particular kind of attire. So the gift has to be bought, the attire probably has to be rented or bought. And so like that also needs to be scheduled, and there's a budget limitation for some of those things, and who are you? So how strong is that obligation? And where is the registry? And so just getting an invitation, it like presupposes under the water, like, there's the iceberg, the tip, and then there's all the stuff that's sort of under the water of all these presuppositions. And similarly too, like when we communicate, very often what we say is not what we communicate, right? Communicative action, there's lots and lots of things that we can say that amount to promising or that amount to not promising. And so these complex interactions can happen. And being able to make a map from what's actually said to the transaction that actually occurred is much more complex than just being able to parse the literal meaning of what's been said. And so, yeah.
I'm wondering what is special about this taking care of elders that makes this a good context? And I'm thinking that at least part of it is what you're just saying now, is that there's this, it's a complex situation with a lot of tacit knowledge that the AI might not have.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are there other situations where a human decision maker cedes decision-making control to an AI that would have all these same issues, or is this really special to the elder care situation?
So I think what makes the good, so this is good because like scientists will say like, look, I'm working on Drusilla, and you're like, is that because you care about that per se? And they're like, no, that's my model system. And so in that sense, I'd say the issues we raise here really come up for older adults, mostly because you're on this slope, which will be a big thing in the actual talk, is like the slope of cognitive decline.
Right.
And so there's one thing when it's like you're at your full mental capacity, and you can kind of keep track of everything. Now the load, the cognitive load that you bear, and the degree to which now we're trying to augment you to be able to do more, then in a certain sense, now you're in an analogous situation to the person whose cognitive capacities are declining, and we're trying to allow you to do the same thing you were doing before. And so in that sense, I think it is much more general, but it arises in particular with older adults because you get the restrictions on cognition, the need for the AI to perform a cognitive task, and then all the consequences, right, of failure being very, very salient. Whereas in other cases, those consequences can be less salient because the full cognitive resources of the reasoner there could sort of be the backstop.
Right. So this is an excellent test case.
Exactly. And So, an important thing, which is also not sort of that new of an insight, but just that the capabilities and limitations of your AI are going to be a nudge in a sense, right? Like what they facilitate is that's going to facilitate what the user is going to do. They're either going to listen to a lot of music if that's what the smart speaker can do, or they're just not going to use the smart speaker if that's all it can do. And so similarly, if you enable, what the functionalities that you enable, those are going to be things where it's like, great, now I can do those things. And if they're the things that I want to do, then you have really enabled me to function. And if they're not the sort of things I want to do, then you might have just pushed me, into, a different area. You might have shifted what I've done, but you might not have enhanced my well-being. So the other paper that I know Hoda already presented to this group was about, well, how should we then think about the notion of benefit here? What does it mean for the system to be aligned with the human's values so that it's producing benefit? And how is benefit and justified paternalism, how are those things related, and how they're different from unjustified paternalism and a bunch of failure modes like exploitation or coercion or domination or deception and so on. And so this work is about, this prior work was about getting value alignment, making sure that like your system can actually carry out the functions that the older adult needs, and identifying some of those, and then identifying some of the challenges in terms of what you have to be able to perceive as salient. So that takes us up to the goal of prolonging independence, and then the talk for today, which is about what if we succeed? So like what if we're able to do those things? And so by prolonging independence now, I'm talking about increasing the time during which some individual I can live according to their own values, pursuing their goals, and then when necessary, making the trade-offs that will reflect their assessment of the relative risks and balance that are, benefits that are available in a situation. So what I mean by that is that we can distinguish something like, hey, I didn't pay their bill. What happened? Here's this anomalous event. I didn't pay a bill. And it's one thing if I was like, yeah, I was running out of money and I had to buy a birthday gift for my grandchild. And of course, I'm going to buy the birthday gift for my grandchild and I'm late and I'm going to have a penalty. But once my social security check comes in, I'll pay the bill. And like, that's just like, there's no way I'm not showing up with a gift, right? That's very, very different from, I didn't know I had to pay the bill. Like, or I didn't know I had that electrical service or that electrical services had to be paid for, right? Then you'd be like, well, something deeper has gone wrong. Similarly, like you're not taking your diuretic. And it's like, yeah, I'm not taking my diuretic because like an hour after I take it, I get dizzy. And I'm much more worried about falling and breaking my hip than I'm worried about the cardiac complications that are going to happen if, from my blood pressure not being well controlled. You might not agree with their decision, but they've made a decision in light of their values. And that's different from like, oh, I just didn't remember I had to take my pill, right? Or I didn't remember where my pills were, or I didn't remember what I need to do to get access to my pills. So what we're trying to do is prolong the period at which people are sort of able to make these top sorts of decisions, right? Live according to their values and not be prone to the failures that are sort of at the bottom. So now I want to explain some features about decisional capacity, because the idea is this is what is going to scaffold out then how AI might help facilitate this goal. So when I has decisional capacity for some decision D, then I has the cognitive capacities necessary to act on their values and to thereby advance their interests relative to D. And so decisional capacity plays a really important role because it's connected centrally to the notion of autonomy. So you're making your own decisions and you're sort of leading your life and pursuing your goals when you're able to sort of see the decisions that are in front of you, ascertain what's at stake, apply your values, and make the decisions that by your own lights are going to be best for you. And doing that is usually how you further your well-being. So in that sense, you make the trade-offs that you do because you say, well, these are what's going to be best for me under the constraints that I'm acting. So decisional capacity is this linchpin between your autonomy and your well-being. Decisional capacity is also a threshold concept in the sense that I has capacity for D or I doesn't. So it's binary, you might say, right? Like, is I competent for D or not competent for D? But it's decision relative. So the idea would be, I could be competent to make one decision, but not competent to make another. So you might not have the capacity to decide what derivatives you're going to trade, but you might have the capacity to order your lunch. That's like a really good example. If decisional capacity were a global threshold, then the idea would be we have to determine whether you have capacity or not, all things considered, for all your decisions. And now it'd be an incredibly blunt instrument, because if we were like, well, you have capacity to make all your decisions, then commodity trading and derivatives are back on the table. And if it's like, as is lunch, but if we're like, well, you really don't understand all that stuff, so you don't have capacity, then it's like, well, now you can't order your lunch either. And so that's why saying like you have capacity or not is too blunt. And so you'd say, look, there are some tasks, they're differentiated by their complexity, perhaps also by the risk that they involve. And so that's going to stratify, and we can say like you have capacity for these sorts of things, but you might lack capacity for these sorts of things, because things that are more complex and riskier are more demanding. And so in that sense, you need more cognitive faculties to do more demanding tasks, and things that are less demanding require, fewer demands on you and cognitively. And this is important because like false positives, so treating a person who lacks decisional capacity as though they have it, is dangerous. Because now somebody is like, I don't want to take my meds. And you're like, oh, well, they must not like some feature of the med. And it's like, no, they just forgot that they don't have to take the med, right? Are they still, are they making a decision that they want to have this increased risk of a cardiac failure? No, that's not what they're saying. They're not communicating their values, because their conduct doesn't reflect their values. Alternatively, false negatives now, right, where we treat a person who has capacity as though they don't, that's unjustified paternalism. Now we're saying you can't make this decision because we don't have capacity for it. And the person is sitting there going, I'll tell you exactly what's at stake in this decision, and you're stopping me from doing it. So now I both can't exercise my agency, and I'm not able to advance my well-being, which is what I would do through the exercise of my agency. And if you get it wrong, then not only are you frustrating my agency, you're frustrating my well-being. So that's why this global concept versus decision relative is important, because the decision relativity now helps us curve fit a little bit better, right? And try to reduce both of these errors. Okay, it's just important to note, this is just to avoid some confusions, that the default assumption is that you're competent to make your own decisions. Like that's the social default. And so in that sense, the burden is on someone else to sort of show that you lack capacity. And usually an assessment of capacity gets triggered by some anomalous event, right? So like, I doesn't pay a bill, and then you might be like, hey, why didn't you pay your bill? Now that isn't sufficient to be like, I doesn't have capacity. Because I could be like, I didn't pay my bill for all those reasons that we talked about before. And you're like, oh, okay, I get it, right? Like you had to make a hard decision and you made a hard decision, but like that was how you did the trade-offs. Anomalous events prompt us to sort of inquire about capacity, but they're not sufficient. The anomalous event isn't sufficient to be like, oh, I doesn't have capacity. And so similarly, we don't make determinations of capacity on the basis of the content of people's decision. So we don't go, well, you didn't pay your bill, why not? And they're like, well, I had to buy this gift for my grandchild. And we don't go like, well, that's a bad decision. Like, you don't have capacity. You might not agree with the decision, right? Like you might be like, a heart attack could be really, really bad. You're at high risk of a heart attack, and your relative is like, I don't want to fall. A broken hip is going to be even worse. Like, and you're like, well, I think a heart attack is worse. And like, these are things you could disagree about, right? And like, you don't want to have a standard of capacity where you're basically like, there are people in the world who have the right kind of lifestyle and like they have capacity, and then we disagree with these other people and they don't. So determinations of capacity are about the process, right? Like, were you able to understand the situation, the relevant facts, the actions that were kind of available to you? This is all an abstraction, by the way. Like, you don't set it up as a decision problem for a person when you're testing capacity, but in effect, you're probing these things, right? Like, why didn't you pay your bill? Well, what were the options you had? Could you have asked somebody else for money? Well, here's why I don't want to ask Johnny for money, Okay, so So this is the background, yeah.
Sorry, I have a question a couple of slides ago.
Yep.
I was trying to, so you seem to portray like false positives are worse than having false negatives?
Not necessarily. They're
Because you
just-
use the word dangerous for one and the other was just, like false negatives seem to be just annoying. False positive, I wasn't sure why they were called dangerous instead, or maybe I'm just over reading them.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not, it's, the other false negatives can be dangerous as well, right? I think the idea though is behind a false positive. So if somebody, so there is an asymmetry. If you lack capacity, but you're doing the things that you would normally do or that we would expect, then we won't question your decision, right? So like if you lack capacity, but nevertheless you wind up paying your bills because it's like automated or something, then no one will question it. It's usually when like you don't pay the bill then that we're like, hey, what's going on there? And if the idea then is, you know, like think about the anomalous things, you're like, I don't want to receive this, I don't want to do this medical care, I don't want to pay this bill, you know, like the things that would be out of the ordinary. And if we were like, oh, well, this reflects, you know, my relative's conception of the good, as opposed to like that they are on a drug that has interfered with their reasoning or that, you know, they're forgetting. Then the idea is they want to have that money. They don't want to spend it on this other thing, or they want to pay their bill, but their choice doesn't reflect their agency.
So you're just pointing that both of these are issues.
Both of them are bad, and I'm just trying to emphasize they're usually bad in different ways. And that there is an asymmetry in the sense that the false positive, there isn't an autonomous person there whose autonomy you're trying to respect. But out of the importance of respecting autonomy, you allow it what you perceive as their decision to go forward, when in fact it isn't their decision in the relevant sense, right? So that's why it's mostly effects on well-being for the first one for false positive. But for false negatives, autonomy and well-being are there and they're connected, and you're frustrating both of them, which can also be dangerous.
Yeah, from an AI's perspective, I was thinking the first one is, I mean, sure, you weren't helpful, right? Like the AI provided some suggestion, wrongly thinking the person has capacity, but it's just not useful. That's their status quo.
Well, you can use the word negligence here as well. So you could say one is negligence and one is paternalism, and negligence is certainly blameworthy.
But I guess I'm comparing it to a baseline where they would not have spoken if you didn't have the AI.
I mean, there is the asymmetry that if everything's going along on an automated way and a person loses capacity, but we believe they still have it, then it can be the case, right, that they've lacked capacity and we're just incorrect in our assessment of that. And that could be that the AI could mask that in a sense, right? But it wouldn't come out until there was some anomalous thing. And now there's still a threat or risk there, because it's like, now if what you're doing is the person, you're going, yep, my older adult relative is fine, they're there, they're making their decisions, when in fact they're not. And then when the next decision that comes up where the AI is like, well, this is your decision to make, then we'd be in trouble. Okay, so now this is just background in terms of, now I can get on the table this notion of like an agency transfer point. And so the idea would be, so what, you know, here I have like time of day, and like this is, you know, this is like I's level of cognition, and this theta is the threshold for some particular decision that they have to make. And so now you're here in the room, you're operating way above that threshold for the decisions that you face in your day. You know, we're not worried about your level of cognitive decline. You know, now there comes a point as you age where maybe there's something like, I can't make this decision in the morning, I can't make this decision in the evening, but like I can, there's a window of lucidity during the day where I could make that. And maybe then there comes a point where it's like, nope, like at no point during the day do you have that window of lucidity. And so now I'm just trying to collapse these sort of like, you know, these pictures down into this graph where it's like, if over time your cognitive capacities decline, then at this point, right, where it's like, yeah, my capacities aren't above this theta threshold, then agency transfer point has been reached. And this is just the idea that now somebody else has to take care of you. Now somebody else has to make those momentous decisions. Now we would say you can't live independently, or at least in terms of, this is always relative to some particular decision, but if this is like, you can't manage your finances anymore, And how are you gonna live independently if you can't manage your finances, if you can't cook anymore, if you can't take your own medications? Then it's like that, those are gonna be things that are going to really potentially inhibit your ability to live independently. And it can be worse because we're talking independent living as in terms of like living alone, then as soon as you reach this sort of point where there's a period during the day when you can't make those decisions, depending on the nature of the decision, it may mean, yeah, you can't. So imagine cooking. And if it's the fact that like you are a breakfast person, but early in the morning, your cognitive capacities are below the relevant threshold, and that means you try to cook before you've had your meds, before you're well fed and you're rested, and so you're prone to forget and all sorts of stuff like that, then we might be like, actually, you can't live alone now, even though there is a period at which you might be capable of doing so, because you're trying to engage in one of these activities when you're not really able to. It's not safe. You're going to do things that you, in a certain sense, don't want to do. So the goal of assistance with AI now is to prolong this period where you, before the agency transfer point gets reached, this period where you have capacity. And so in that sense, it's like moving the curve further to the right in terms of time. And now the question is, how could AI, like what are the strategies that AI could use to do that? And so one is timing. So if your AI system can control when you make a decision and prohibit you or inhibit you from making a decision outside of that time, then it could extend the capacity, the time at which you have decisional capacity. Because the idea would be something like, in order for me to spend money, I've got to go through my AI, and my AI is like, oh, until you've had your lunch, had your meds, and an hour has gone by, we don't do shopping. And then it would be like, wow, okay, so I'm locked out of it. But then when I shop, right, I'm shopping in my window of lucidity, but like after dinner, I'm locked out again. And of course, the AI would have to know, because different people are different. Like you can have, like you eat, you have your meds, but then your med, goes down, and then you have your dinner, and you take a nap, and so there could be multimodal periods during the day, and the AI would need to know, like, hey, where are you in this, right? And then it would have to be like, yep, we can shop now. We can text our relatives, or we can do whatever the things are that, where our threshold would really be dependent on the level of cognition that we had. So here, this is just about shaping when the agent is and is not able to engage in the activities that are fundamental to them, but where the rate of decline that they've experienced means it can be a challenge for them at some point. Another thing would be, could the AI reduce the complexity of the task that the individual has to perform? And so you could think here of something like, if you have an older adult who has to take meds, sometimes they're taking 6, 8, 12 medicines. They have complex, like these have to be taken on an empty stomach. These have to be taken on a full stomach. This gets taken twice a day. This gets taken, and then they come in these giant, jars, and you have to put them in dispensers. And so it's actually very complicated. And so if you had a system that was like, okay, take that jar, you put 3 of those in, each day. No, you've only put 2 in, put a third in. Oh, that's 4, right? Then the idea would be maybe you alone, unaugmented, don't have the capacity, right? This is my data somehow got, they disappeared. But this was the level you alone would be functioning at. But if the AI can make the task less complicated, then it could bring, it could be the sort of thing that you could do. And again, maybe during particular periods of the day or not, or whatever. And but you get the idea that, so in the first, the AI is acting on basically context. In the second, the AI is acting on complexity. In the third, AI would be acting on risk. So could the AI repackage decisions in ways that change their risk profile? So When you start out with the AI, it might be like you have, you're in your full, robust middle age, and it's like, yep, you cook all your meals from scratch or whatever. I watch you, I see what you like. And then there comes a point where it's like, okay, so doing all of that would be too difficult. But there's a set of things that I know that you like, and I know the periodicity with which you like things. Like I just ate Thanksgiving dinner like 10 times in a row. Like I'm the one that eats the leftovers, and I'm like, yes, breakfast, lunch, dinner, And there's other people that are like, I ate that meal once. I can't eat that again for another calendar year. Like everything must be different. And it's like, great, who are you? What's your, the AI builds the model that, yeah, this is how you like things. And then it can be like, here's a bunch of menus. And by the way, like I can also pre-order these things for you, maybe from, Giant Eagle or Amazon or Aldi, whatever, to have them delivered or something like that. And so then the idea is like, you're not gonna make food that you're not gonna eat. You're gonna be able to have the meals. It's not that you're gonna forget to do it and so on. So here, by taking on some of the cognitive load, the AI would be reducing the risk of the decision that you're facing. And then the last would be the AI could just enhance your own capabilities. So in that sense, it would be moving your abilities up above the threshold. And so that can happen by literally augmenting your memory. So you don't remember that the stove is on, but there are sensors and other things where it's like, hey, you didn't turn off the stove. You don't remember you need to take your pills, but the AI is like, yep, I saw you take your pills. I know the schedule. You didn't take them. It's time to take them. So augmenting memory and sensory capacities by making use of this sort of multimodal data that would be available, then in a certain sense, the human's capacities are being enhanced such that without the AI, they would be prone to fires in the kitchen. With the AI and in some sense, the smart environment, that they can be alerted and avoid those things. And so these act in concert, but these would be the strategies. And so you could imagine then that without the AI, there would be this point at which you'd be like, I don't think I can live alone anymore. Or your younger adult children would be like, yeah, we don't think that you can live alone anymore. But with the AI, that would get pushed out into the future, where you're like, yep, I was here, but now that AI is able to augment my senses, my memory, reshape the tasks I have, package them in ways that are less risky, give them to me at different times of the day, and so I can live independently for a longer period. So in a certain sense, this is the ambition of what we're going for. And now the question is, what happens if we succeed? What should we do now? Because we want to make decisions ex ante about what we should do at this point. And this is going to be a decision under uncertainty, right? Because it's like, well, what's your rate of decline? Because ideally, you would have this system before you started to decline, so it can learn all these patterns about you and things like that, right? This is notion of like customization and value alignment. And so the thing you don't know is like, am I going to precipitously decline tomorrow? Am I never going to decline? I'm going to be one of these 100-year-old people that's like, still publishing in science and, how effective will the AI be? So you can imagine profiles of people where the strategies that I outlined work really well. And you can imagine profiles of people where the same system with the same capabilities, just the sort of the challenges that they face don't lend themselves as well to the support from the AI system. Also, how complex and capable the AI is itself a variable here, right? Because if you start to imagine like super complicated AIs, then you might be like, oh, well, then you'd never reach this point, right? Like it's just going to take care of you until you die. I think that's probably farther out into the future. And then welcome to ethics. Like, you're like, yeah, it's like the last day of class and, or the last week of class. And it's like, yeah, when are you going to die? But that's uncertain, and so you don't know. You could die tomorrow, you could die far out beyond this. And so it's like, yeah, maybe I'll never reach the initial agency transfer point, right? It's like, I'm gonna die here before I even experience cognitive decline. But maybe I'm not gonna die till out here, and I'm gonna reach that second agency transfer point, and then what's gonna happen? Especially since if we've succeeded, then what happens is you've lived independently, now dependent on this system, but now your rate of decline has increased to the point where the system can't help you anymore. So now you're independently living, but you can't take care of yourself, and the assistant that was helping you can't help you anymore. So what should our policy be for when we reach this point? Because, and moreover, the more that we succeed at doing what we're supposed to be doing in AI caring and trying to develop the capacity to do these things, then the higher the probability is that there's going to be people who will reach that second agency transfer point, right? That is to say that we'll help some people live independently, the plane will get off the ground, and then we're like, how do we land it? So in that sense, I think we have to think about AI as a bridge technology here. What we're trying to bridge is the period of the first transfer point to the last transfer point, right? So we're trying to bridge your capacity, but at the end of the bridge now is like someone else has to make decisions for you and take care of you. And that means they have to live, either move in with you, you don't live alone anymore, or you have to move into the, you know, the assisted living facility or the independent living facility or something like that. And we have this paper that I wrote with one of my students, Aidan Castigian, a long time ago, that's about, you know, this question: should you be allowed to decide how to decide? Because if we want to make this decision ex ante, then what we're saying is like, here, you have the decision to buy or not buy this AI system. And now should it be, yep, you can buy this AI system and use it and decide never to address this question. Like, hey, what happens when you reach the agency transfer point? That's uncomfortable. I don't want to think about it. So I don't have to ever think about it. Or should it be, in order to use this AI system, you have to tell us now what to do at that point in the future. That's actually what we argue for in this paper. That's about having like a valve, like a mechanical valve put in while you wait for a heart transplant. So let's think about some of the strategies that we might use here. So one is like a laissez-faire strategy, where you're like, we need to respect the autonomy of people. That's what this is all about. Like, trying to preserve independent living is about trying to preserve people's autonomy. And one of the things that people can have preferences over is how long they like to think about really unsettling things like, when am I going to die? And when am I going to not be able to take care of myself? And then, you know, who should make my financial decisions for me once I can't do that? And who should make my medical decisions for me once I can't do that? That's disturbing and unsettling. If I don't want to think about it, I shouldn't have to think about it. And so that includes respect for autonomy here, might include letting people make a decision we disagree with, perhaps, that like, I don't want to think about that until I have to. And then, of course, the whole worry is you might be like, yep, I don't want to think about that until I have to. But once you have to, you're no longer able to think about it. That's the point. You missed the window. So forcing ex-ante contingency planning or advanced care planning, this would be the sort of the advanced, like, what is my advanced care plan for once my AI can no longer help me? That could make people uncomfortable and could also detract from their present well-being. Concerns are that, you know, this decision isn't entirely personal. So, you know, your decision about whether you take your medicine or not, you know, whether you prefer to face the risk of a fall versus the risk of a heart attack, that's primarily a decision that affects you and your well-being, and you're going to be the one that's going to experience that. But when you reach an agency transfer point, your interests are certainly implicated. So it's not that your interests aren't implicated, they are, but so are the interests of lots of other people. One of them is someone has to take care of you. Who's that person? And then there's a social interest. We don't want to have a society in which it's like, yes, there's potentially lots of elderly people who are in their homes unable to take care of themselves. And so the well-being is languishing because nobody knows that they're there and they can't take care of themselves. Additionally, once you no longer have the capacity to make a decision for yourself, there's a social interest in ensuring that the people who do make decisions for you are making decisions that are aligned with your values. So, throughout your life, you have like typical medical example. Like you're gay, you have a same-sex lover, and your family has always not liked that. And so now who makes your decisions for you? If the social default is like now it's, a member of your family who makes that decision, and they're like, great, now we make that decision. Well, your partner, your spouse is out, right? And it's like, well, that was a relationship of meaning and value that you were a part of. You may not realize that that's being taken from you, but your partner probably does. And so the social interest in making sure that people are treated in line with their values persists, even if your awareness of that starts to degrade. So, so we want to avoid anything where we sort of socially sanction the idea that, haha, once you lose capacity now, other people can take care of you according to their values, because that comes a little bit close to being like your property or you're somebody else's, like an entity in somebody else's story, rather than being the sort of the main character in your own story. And then there's an instrumental value to that as well, in the sense that if we try to take care of you in ways that reflect the values that you live during your life, that minimizes the chance that you're going to be harmed by people trying to do things to you that you didn't want to do. And especially since life is full of things where people make very different decisions. And so if we knew the decision that you wanted to make, so in medicine all the time, it would come down to like, is my relative going to refuse unwanted medical care? And there can be people who are like, yes, of course I am. I gave an advance directive. I told my decision maker, I don't want to live on a ventilator for a long time. And then the period comes where they'd be vent dependent. And then it's like, well, if we take that off, we'd be killing them. And then the idea is they wouldn't want that. We're respecting their wishes. So ensuring that people, so conduct that one person might regard as harming them, we would say, no, we're not harming them. We're living according to their wishes. That's because we have some sense of what their wishes are. And then the idea is there's a prior obligation to respect them. So the laissez-faire policy seems to make this more difficult, because it says in advance, we'd be letting people become dependent on an AI system, and we're going to let them decide how to decide about agency transfer points. And so the people who are then like, well, I'll make that decision down the road, and then they get far enough down the road, they can't make that decision. Then the question would be, do we know how they would want to be treated? Do we know who would they would want to call? Like, your relative can't make this financial decision anymore. Who's supposed to do that for them? I don't know. They can't take their meds anymore. Who are you supposed to tell? I don't know. So another alternative would be to say, okay, laissez-faire, but there's just a social default. So like, for medical decisions, we can't just be like, well, now the doctors get to decide, right? Like that's never acceptable. So we're like, great, every state will have a social default. So there's a social default, like, depending on your age and stuff like that, it would be your living parents or your oldest children or your spouse or whatever, but there'd just be a list. And then it would be like, hey, if you lack capacity and you haven't determined who's going to make this decision for you, here's the society's list. And so that avoids neglect and abandonment. And it allows you to sort of avoid very difficult decisions ex ante for the people who really want to avoid them. It's not clear that it avoids cases where I wouldn't want to be taken care of by someone, because exactly the example I gave you, where it's like I'm alienated from my family because they don't like my lifestyle choices. And then the social list is like, yep, it's that family who makes decisions for you. Well, that would have, you'd be vulnerable to that here. And then you might say, well, the people would know that. And then the question is, how often do the people who don't want to think about this thing go, what's the list? Right? Like we're in a space now where it's like, if you're most vulnerable to this, you're the person that doesn't want to think about it. So you're also the person who's least likely to know what the social list is, and then it might conflict with your considered values. And it does require some sort of social agreement, right? Like we'd have to all now get together and be like, well, what should that be? And should it be always just one list? Should it be different for finances, medicine, other things? A more ambitious one would be laissez-faire plus AI choice. If I doesn't determine who to transfer agency to, then the AI will contact the person that it thinks I would want. And now I guess this is where I sort of imagine this sort of like imaginary slider where the value is like, how sophisticated is the AI, you know, and it's like something we can cook up now versus like, I don't know, Star Trek or, you know, like some future success that we have that avoids neglect and abandonment. It doesn't require difficult decisions, but now the probability that you're going to avoid those cases where the person who takes care of the person is the wrong person, that's now entirely a function of like, what's the AI like? And by the way, have we validated what it can do here? And what's that like? Like, what's that validation process like? And then who would be liable in this circumstance, right? So if the idea was we're like, yep, our AI, you know, if you don't determine who to transfer agency to, our AI is going to make its best guess. Then is it that, I mean, then presumably all like the vendors are going to be like, yeah, we're not liable for that. Like we told you up front, like it's going to make its best guess, no guarantee. By the way, the guess could just be we flipped the coin, like, you know, and you're going to live with that. And then the weird thing I think we don't want to avoid, we want to avoid a social circumstance in which we're kind of encouraging people to rely on a thing that might not do what they want it to, and then they'd be in this very vulnerable circumstance. And so in that sense, more like a pure strategy, a sort of like, yeah, it's just all laissez-faire, you know, or like, no, you can't do it at all, might be better than one of these things where it's like, you should feel confident that you're going to be taken care of, but there's actually no guarantee that, you know, you're going to be taken care of. I mean, even more ambitious would be the AI just takes the care of you, right? And it's like, yeah, that I think for me, that's sort of like, that's outside the bounds of AI caring because we're not going to have that kind of success, you know, in the foreseeable future. We're going to have to deal with agency transfer points before we get to the point where it's like, yeah, you can be entrusted the AI will take care of you. So another thing is to say, no, you have to require advanced care planning, which is the position that we took in relative to these bridge technologies, like getting a heart, automated heart. So here the idea would be before you require assistance, the AI would say, you need to specify for each of these domains that I help you in, who I'm supposed to reach out to. And otherwise, I will stop working perhaps. So I guess it could be, otherwise I'll stop working and you can't use me. So that would be specify the plan or else you can't use the system. Or it would be like, look, you need to specify this because otherwise here's who's going to be called. You're in your state, here's the order. And so it's like, if, you know, they're going to call your cousin Johnny or, you know, whatever. And like, if you don't like Johnny doing it, then you've got to tell me who else. And actually the interesting thing then is like the dynamic nature of these systems, right? It makes it much more feasible that sort of requiring this up front could be the sort of thing that then you could negotiate with that person over time, because the system could be like, you know, I'm helping you make your, you know, your grocery orders. And like, you know, in the future, if I can't do that and you can't do it, like the state says I have to have Johnny do it, you know, is that okay with you? Is there somebody else that you would prefer? And so that kind of negotiation process could be kind of offloaded onto the AI. And then what you would need then would be some verification, right? That like, you know, when it's like, yeah, I'm calling Johnny because you can't do your groceries anymore, that it's like, and here's the recording. When it was like, hey, you know, it's you know, your cousin who'd be specified, and you're like, oh, I don't want that. I want my cousin Johnny. It's like, okay, good. Here, I can give you that snippet where you know, this person indicated here's who they wanted. Anyway, so this is the project, right? The project is trying to think about like, here are the viable strategies for, you know, extending the time that you live independently. Increasing our technical abilities will increase our ability to do that for people, which is great. That's sort of part of the vision. But for the foreseeable future, it's not going to extend those indefinitely. And so now we have to think, before you build, you know, before the rain, you have to build the ark. So now we have to think about when we reach these agency transfer points, what should we do? How should we handle it? And in particular, like, should we be like, hey, if that's uncomfortable and you don't want to think about it, that's fine, you don't have to think about it. Or should we be like, no, actually you have to think about it. And you either have to do it before you buy the system, you have to do it with the system, there's a cutoff, there's a month, I don't know, because like you don't want to wind up in a system where it's like the system waits too long. And thank you for listening. Oh, thanks to my collaborators for feedback, Jody and Miley, Samantha, and Jonathan. All the errors are mine.
This is really interesting, and my first thought is that people have been getting old and losing their capacity for hundreds of thousands of years. And in the days before AI, like there was a transfer point where someone should be taking over, but there's no requirement that the person specify that ahead of time. So what is it about AI that suddenly creates this moral imperative that the person has to specify that ahead of time? Like, it seems like an omission bias. If we weren't doing it, like, before, when we didn't have AI, we weren't forcing people to do this. So what is it about the commission of bringing in AI that makes us think we need to make people do it?
Okay, great. I really like that because I actually think that's not, I think we did do it before, and we did think people were required to do it before. We just didn't think about it that way.
Oh.
So I think a lot of these things are like, the things come up with AI because AI surfaces now something that we sort of took as a matter of fact.
Okay.
And so now it's like, wait a minute, what's the analog for that here, right? Because like for a long time, you know, it would be like, look, what's going to happen? You're living in your home and it's dangerous. And so like social services, you know, like if you fall and you go to the older adult falls and they go to the ER, right? And it's kind of like, well, what's your circumstance? Like maybe we're going to send social services around. And then social services is like, you live here alone. There's a dead mouse in your drawer. A lot of the food in your refrigerator is rotten. Like you're going to a home.
But that's not pre-planning, right? That's
Exactly.
reacting.
Right, exactly. And so then we do things like, well, that we want to avoid, look, like sometimes we go into people's homes and they're dead. And we're like, wait, how did we not know about this? Like, what should we do for older adults, right? With medical care, precisely because medical care, there's no default. Your doctor can't just be like, yeah, this is what you want. Then there's a big movement to encourage people to make advanced directives. And it's entirely because of this. It's like, what, do you want to be on a ventilator? Do you want to be maintained? Like, is there kind of medical care you would want to refuse? And the older you get, the more important. My Thanksgiving tradition, I encourage you all, is to ask people, your loved ones, what they want to have happen to them at the end of life.
But, okay, so I like that answer, but advanced directives usually apply after you already get into the hospital. They don't apply like 6 months earlier when you can't pay your bills or remember to eat lunch.
That's because advanced directives are about medicine. And then the reason why these things become salient with AI is that all of a sudden now we're offloading these tasks, these critical tasks, to a machine, basically, and we're relying on the machine. And then the question is like, great, so now what should we do though when we can't rely on the machine? Who should we rely on? And
But if there wasn't a machine to rely on, why weren't we asking the question, who should we rely on, given that there's no machine to rely on? Like,
I guess
if we
I
weren't
don't-
asking that question then, why are we asking it now?
I guess I don't see that we weren't. I think we
okay.
were, and that's why we might be like, yeah, sorry, you're going to the home now. Like you reached the agency transfer point, you know, you reached the agency transfer point here and you went to the home. Right. And, you know, maybe you were lucky, people found it out and they saw that it wasn't safe. Like the fire alarm, smoke alarm went off because you left the pan on the stove. People came, they're like, wow, we did a cognitive assessment. Like, you know, you're in trouble. Worst case, like the fire burned down. We're like, why did the house burn down? We figured it out later. Like, so I think we do make that, right? And that's exactly why we're trying to do this, is extend that period. And, you know, so I think just the informal planning, like what do we do when our loved one can't take care of themselves? Usually you're like, well, that's just what families do. And the state doesn't really interfere in it. And then when people are indigent and don't have families, that's when it's like, yeah, social services comes around and looks in on you.
Okay, I have a second question, which will make me sound hypocritical and opposite to what I just said. That's because I'm thinking about through these things. So I'm familiar with the concept of automated hovering, where there will be like automated symptom status monitoring in the patient's home, like a diabetic person will do their blood sugar several times a day and it will get zipped into an algorithm and then the physician gets alerted if it's outside. So rather than the patient having to be hospitalized or come into the clinic like every week, they get to live at home, but the physicians have this sort of remote monitoring of what's going on. But a key part of that system, as I understand it, is that an actual human person, the physician, gets alerted when something bad is going on in the patient's home so that they intervene. So I would think with these one way to set up these AI assistant situations is that you have a designated backup decision maker, like from the very beginning, not just waiting for this point of transfer, but if the AI needs to report to somebody, like I can't get this guy to take his medication no matter what I do. Or your grandfather hasn't eaten a meal in 3 days. Like rather than just the AI talking to the elderly person themselves and saying, you really should eat, like there should be a backup person they can contact, in which case you don't. I guess this is supporting your pre-planning
Right.
solution.
That's what we're talking about,
Right,
designating
right.
who's the person I'm supposed to call when I get into those.
Right,
Those
but those
situations.
situations might happen like the next day, not 3 years later.
Well, I guess this
Like,
is,
this is always gonna happen.
but see, this is where I feel like that we're chunking things together in ways like, I'm not sure how it would be possible to be like, yep, we're gonna have a system that's gonna learn your preferences through this complex multimodal, longitudinal, engagement thing that you buy the day before you lose capacity. And it's like, well, if I bought it the day before I lose capacity, it doesn't know me. There's been no multimodal, so, and in that sense, I think this is just a socio-technical problem. Like, you're gonna have to have this thing for a while in order for it to be like, well, what's my estimate of this curve? Right? Like, how are you doing? Or what's anomalous for you? What's normal for you? What's anomalous? So if you buy it right before, so what's gonna happen, and what usually happens is the kid buys it for you. And now the kid has to program the system. And so now it's like this extra layer of complexity and vulnerability, because it's like, does the kid know what you want? Does the kid know your values? Oftentimes it's like, yes, I'm going to have a camera. I'm going to see you, listen to you, and sometimes other people are like, I actually didn't want to be constantly spied on all the time.
So I like this project. I applaud it. I think this is a good direction to move in to sort of balance autonomy and beneficence. Love it. But here are two challenges, and I'd like to hear how you try to deal with them. One of them is that people's values change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are trying to train a model on people's values, especially if you sort of average over the values of all their data of their life, then you're going to miss out on, well, I should say, you're going to miss out on that distinction between, the values that they have now as opposed to earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe now they would not want to be treated in certain conditions where in the past they would have, or vice versa.
Yep.
And the other challenge is, you talked about capacity as based on values, but it's also based on beliefs. And so, this is always a classic problem, is trying to distinguish when somebody has a value versus somebody just has a false belief or a mistaken belief. Do they refuse a blood transfusion because they're a Seventh-day Adventist, or because they read on Facebook that blood transfusions are going to give them, it's Bill Gates trying to control their mind. And so, under some conditions, we might think we're justified in overriding their bad epistemic states. Those aren't values, those are just mistaken beliefs. And, if you're just training a model on all of their attitudes, it might collapse across these and you might have a hard time distinguishing.
Let me start with the second one, because I think, I'm not sure that it matters whether what you have is a false belief or a value I don't like.
Yeah.
Those would be two propositional attitudes that I wouldn't, that I disagree with, say.
Yeah.
I think the question in both those cases would be, is the process of reasoning still, like, is it a real process of reasoning? Like, I could be like, look, I'll show you the experts who have said this is what happens, right? And then I could be like, well, I'll show you the studies, or whatever, like, and if we're having an argument, then it's like, I don't like your belief, but like, and in fact, I think it would be really terrible. My understanding, and I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is like Steve Jobs died precisely because he had a false belief that like he would be able to think his way out of pancreatic cancer. And his doctors were like, dude, there is no reason to think that you can do that. And he's like, I'm Steve Jobs. And then once he came back and he was like, okay, what do you got? They're like, Windows closed, guy. Like I told you, you had to have this treatment. And so he had what, I would say was a bunch of false beliefs, but like, we can't be like, oh, your beliefs are false. So
Yeah.
we get to live your life
That's
for you.
fine. Yeah,
Yeah. So in that sense, I think it's not a separate.
then you don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
But the first point is still a challenge, right? The first point is still a challenge, and I think it's particularly challenged. So this is where I think now what you get is the interface where I try to work, which is like, okay, so I can tell you about the ethics and the values and what we want this to be like, but now what you have to do is turn that into something that is machine learnable problem, or that you can represent, where it's like, yeah, I can't be averaging over what you said about this at all times, right? Because like at this point you had an attitude, but then other things happen and you're like, yeah, like I wanted Johnny to make these decisions for me, but I changed my mind. Like I've seen how Johnny's, like I don't want Johnny to do that now. And it's like, great, it's got to be now, not your previous belief. Now that's a problem for us at all things, because if you write a will or an advance directive and you change your mind, you better let us know that you changed your mind, right? But this elicitation process then, so this is another thing that we're sort of working on now, which is sort of like, what should this elicitation process be? Exactly what is it you're trying to elicit? What's the structure of those values, especially since I don't think people have a single utility function. So you're not you can't use revealed preference and you can't learn a single utility function. You're learning a structure, and you can't do that just by observing. And so I think the beautiful thing is being able to have these interactions where you can have these dialogues and you can be like, you were just at this party, and Johnny was at the party, and you've been at 5 parties that Johnny's been at. Like, is that an accident, or do you like to go to parties where Johnny's there? Right? Because it's confounded. You can just ask the question, and then they can be like, yeah, if Johnny's there, I'm going to be there. Or no, I like parties. And like, I hate this guy, Johnny. Like, those are 2 very different worlds, and you could tease them apart. You could answer that counterfactual just by having a conversation.
Yeah, if you're still in that window where they're competent.
Exactly, which is why I think you'd have to have this run up.
Right.
And then in the first paper, we sort of talk about like, yes, you have to have this run up. And by the way, now that thing is going to have a model of you that's going to be incredibly sensitive, mostly because it's going to have a projection. And you might not want to know it. So it's going to be like, yep, like I have a forecast of like your rate of cognitive decline because I've had to increasingly help you. And now like, you might not want to know it. What if you do? Hey, what do you think of my rate of decline? I think that's fine. It should be able to be like, here's my model. It could be right or wrong, whatever. But like, should Google know it? It's like, hey, let me send this back to Google. And then all of a sudden in your mail, it's like, hey, here's the advertisements for the thousands of things that we can sell you. I don't think that's a good business model for things that are going to do this, because they're going to have pretty intimate knowledge of you. And I don't think once people realize that, I don't think they're going to be comfortable with it being like, yeah, Procter & Gamble gets that profile of you, Johnson & Johnson, Walmart.
Yeah. Discovering new privacy frontiers. Great.
It seems like early adoption is really a big challenge here. Are you developing any frameworks around that? Because if people are, as you were saying, like they need to adopt this technology early on, and maybe somebody else needs to adopt it for them. So thinking of that as a formal framework, or like what are the factors that go into ensuring that early adoption, and is there work around that?
I mean, it's an interesting, so it's not something that that I know, it's not something I'm looking at. I mean, it's been a thing that we've sort of talked about, just in the sense that like this setup kind of requires that, right? And in particular, like, if you get to this point and then you're like, what can I implement? Then I think you have to think about that very differently. Now you have to think of that as you have a caregiver that has a bunch of limitations, and now the AI system is augmenting the capabilities of the caregiver, right? Like I can't see you when I'm at work, but if the AI system can, and it can make sure that you don't leave the stove on, then it's not, as it were, like raising your capabilities, it's raising my capabilities. And one of the things we are looking at is this multi-agent alignment problem, where the AI, if you're the recipient of care, then it has to care for you in accordance with your values. But if I'm the older child, that and I have obligations to care for you, so I have certain duties that have to get discharged, then the system is, in a certain sense, I'm relying on the system to discharge my duties to you. So now there's got to be an intersection that's not empty there, right? Where it can do the things you want to do in the way you want them, and that discharges my duties to you. Otherwise, then there's going to be like a conflict. So I do think this like early adoption, matters. And I do think we've already said in the first paper, like the business model for this would have to be very different than like the business model for your Echo or, your smart speaker or something like that.
And especially because of that interaction, right? It's not just that you can take the user factors, the support caregivers factors and societal factors into account. You actually need to model like interactions between them, which are.
I have a quick question about the wording of the cognition, because recently I fly several long haul flights and I find myself kind of prone to forget things which I didn't do before this extended period of jet lagging. So in terms of cognition, what if the AI system just kick in when I tend to forget things because I'm traveling a lot, and I find that, oh, this is really good. So I just my tools get rusty. For example, if I didn't cook a meal for an extended long period, I might need to think about, oh, how did I cook it before? And then I just figure it out, bit by bit. But if the AI kicks in, I might just as well lose the capability of cooking, not capability, but the ability to cook that meal.
Mhm.
Is that kind of like within the scope of cognition or something else?
So I think I would like to be able to say something about exactly the kinds of the cases that you've talked about, because I worry that and this gets back to Gretchen's first sort of comment about like, do you care about this like specifically because of older adults, or because it's like Drusilla and you care about something like, broader, and I care about something broader? Because I sort of feel like, if you're like, yep, there's a bunch of stuff I need to remember, and it turns out when I'm jet lagged, I'm really bad at it. So now I want my AI system to do it. It's like, great, did you have it before? Because if you didn't, how is it going to know what you need to do in order to remember it, right? So in that sense, it's sort of like, that's another example of like, wow, I find that there's a circumstance in which I need help, but if I'm already in the circumstance, this isn't going to be much help to me. But if I know it's recurring, like, oh, I messed up one time when I flew, so now in my preparation, right, you could imagine like, right now, most of my memory is on my Apple Notes pad. And then, if Apple Intelligence gets better, that it'd be able to be like, hey, on your notepad, it said you had to send this email once you landed, and you landed 2 hours ago, right? And then you'd be like, wow, yeah, great. That's really helping me. And then I think there could be lots of things where, so why would you care about being an early adopter? And I think it might be, well, because there might be lots of things where, so there's lots of dishes where you cook or other things that you make where you're like, yeah, I got really good at this. Right? It's tricky, and I got really good at it. And so you had to like write down somewhere, right? Like, oh, actually the recipe's wrong. You got to take away, or whatever. Or there's some technique, and then you're like, I can get rusty at that. But it's like, oh, maybe I can kind of have this assistant that would sort of remind me, like, don't forget these, because you could sort of be like, I need my future self to remember the trick here is that you got to do this sort of thing, right? Beat it this way, or, whip it this way, or, whatever, while you're cooking. And then the more that it could do something like that, the more then this thing is this repository. And then in a certain sense, like that's what you'd need in terms of like, look, what I have is all this menu. Like I wrote down my shopping list, it's in my cart, the meals that it can construct out of it. And then it just asks me like, which of these sets of meals do you want? It orders the sets of groceries, and then it knows how I prepare them, so it can kind of walk me through it. And now it's like, by watching me while I was competent, it can walk me through the things so that even as I would forget or I'd lose it could sort of help me do it and facilitate my ability to do that for longer. That doesn't seem that far-fetched.
Gotcha. So is this kind of like, can I understand at a level of cognition as a combined cognition of me and my agent?
Well, yeah, because remember, right, that like in some of these strategies, right, like I think these are all, so if you think about this from like a capability standpoint, right, then, like the time during the day is a function of your environment. So this is like, there's an environmental parameter there, and that the AI might be able to influence. There's a complexity parameter that the AI might be able to influence, a risk parameter, and then there's just the features of you, and the AI can be something that augments those features of you, because you rely on your wet memory, and then increasingly as you age, you're relying on your silicon memory, and you're relying on your perception, something some's burning. But increasingly then you could rely on sensors in your environment that are like, hey, the stove's still on and you're not in the room. Did you mean to do that? So in that sense, the capability approach that we take in the beneficent intelligence papers is always in the background here, in terms of thinking of these things less as like they live inside the agent and they're just a function of your environment, the task, how the task is ordinarily done, ways in which the task, most of the tasks are multiply realizable, right? So, instead of making it from scratch, you use a mix, or something like that, right? Where these are two different ways of ultimately achieving functionally the same goal.
Our Zoom crowd is astonished into silence. So, any other questions for our speaker? If not, let's thank him again.
Thanks for coming.